She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, to keep her chin down and her voice absent, her hands rough from borrowed labor, her name buried beneath a stranger's silence. She had become very good at it, at the quiet stillness of someone who had learned that being seen was the same as being caught. She had thought herself safe. She had been wrong. The moment she walked through the gates of Harwick Hall's stable yard and into the grey October morning, a pair of storm blue eyes had found her and had not looked away since. He was a duke with a secret he carried like a stone in his chest. She was a lady with a secret she carried like a blade beneath her boot. Neither of them had expected to need the other. Neither of them knew yet that they already did. If you are listening for the first time, welcome. Tell me in the comments where you are, what the hour is, what brought you here tonight. I read every single one. This story is a work of fiction. All characters and events are invented for the purposes of this narrative. She had spent 3 years in hiding. He had spent 4 years carrying proof of her father's innocence, unable to deliver it. Between them, a sealed document, a dead man's name, and the quiet cruelty of 2 people who were far better at keeping secrets than at being known. This is how they found each other anyway. The morning she was hired, the rain had not yet decided whether to be a drizzle or a storm. She stood at the gates of Harwick Hall's stable yard with mud on her boots and a cap pulled so low the brim nearly touched her nose. She had given her name as Lev. She did not speak. When the head groom, a broad-shouldered man named Hartley with weathered hands and the impatient eyes of someone who had seen too many useless hires, asked her directly whether she was deaf or merely stupid, she shook her head twice, once for each insult, and pointed to her throat with one slow, deliberate finger. Hartley sucked his teeth, looked her up and down with the practiced assessment of a man measuring a horse for work. She was slight, yes, too slight for stable work perhaps, but slight was not the same as weak, and 3 years had taught her that in ways she had not expected to learn. She had filled her coat with extra cloth at the shoulders, wrapped her chest with strips of linen so many times she barely remembered what it felt like to breathe without restriction. Her hair was sheared close to her skull by her own hand 2 months earlier, using a pair of dressmaking scissors taken from the sewing room of the last house she had fled. She kept her chin level, her gaze direct. She did not look away from him. Hartley turned to the boy beside him, a freckled adolescent named Pip who smelled of hay and nervous energy, and said, "He'll do," with the grudging authority of a man who had hired worse and expected to hire worse again. He handed her a pitchfork and pointed at the leftmost stall without ceremony. She worked. She did not speak. She did not falter. She had discovered over 3 years that it was easier to disappear into labor than into stillness. Stillness invited questions, the sideways glances, the murmured comparisons, the quiet suspicion that attached itself to a person who sat quietly where others moved. Labor invited only more labor. If your hands were busy and your direction was clear, most people looked past you as though you were another piece of the furniture. The stables of Harwick Hall were old, stone-built and competently maintained, smelling of hay and horse, and the distinct sweetness of oats kept warm in the closed tack room. There were 11 horses in residence. She learned their names by the 3rd day, not from being told but from listening, from standing close enough to hear the grooms murmur to their charges the way people murmured to things they trusted. Hartley called his favorite mare Duchess, which she found quietly ironic given the circumstances. She was 3 weeks into her employment when she first saw the Duke. He came at dawn, which surprised her. She had not expected the Duke of Harwick to visit his own stables before breakfast, and certainly not on foot, without an escort, in riding clothes that looked less like the costume of aristocratic leisure and more like genuine preparation for effort. He wore dark breeches and a plain coat of charcoal wool, no hat. His hair was dark and without powder, pushed back from his forehead as though he had forgotten to attend to it, or had simply never seen the point. She kept her head down. She was raking out the stall of the grey gelding Anchor, whose temper was poor in the mornings, and whose opinion of the rake she had already come to know was worse. She heard the Duke's footstep before she saw him. Steady, deliberate, not the uncertain tread of a man walking somewhere unfamiliar, but the confident weight of one who owned every stone underfoot and had never had reason to doubt it. It struck her immediately, that distinctive gait, the absence of hesitation even in a private space. She had learned to categorize footsteps the way other people catalogued faces. This one said, "In command of the ground beneath him." He spoke briefly to Hartley, in a voice low enough that she caught rhythm but not words. She did not look up. She continued her work, drawing the rake in long, even strokes, moving the soiled straw to one side with the technique she had been taught by a groom in Yorkshire 2 years ago. Everything she knew about horses, she had learned in borrowed houses from borrowed staff, carefully, efficiently, in the way she had learned everything since her world had contracted to the space of whatever room she currently occupied. What she did not expect was for the footsteps to stop at Anker's stall. She felt it before she processed it, the sharp quality of attention that pressed against the back of her neck, like the flat of a cold hand. She did not look up immediately. She counted to 4, finishing the stroke of the rake, completing the motion she had begun. Then, with the unhurried rhythm of someone with nothing to hide, she turned. Storm blue eyes. That was her first thought. Not a color she had expected on a man with such dark hair, but there they were, clear and absolutely still, and aimed at her with a kind of focus that was not hostility, but was not kindness either. It was the look of a man categorizing, assessing. She recognized it because she used it herself. She held the rake with both hands and tilted her head just slightly in the way she had learned communicated respectful acknowledgement without servility. A fraction, just enough. He said nothing. He looked at her, not with the rapid, dismissive sweep that Hartley employed, or the incurious blink of the other grooms, but with the kind of deliberate attention that did not rush to a conclusion, as though she were a problem he had not yet decided to solve. Then he turned to Anker, held out his hand, flat-palmed. The grey gelding, who had bared his teeth at her 3 mornings running, who had made a project of her inconvenience, stepped forward and blew a long breath against the Duke's palm, with the ease of an old acquaintance greeting an old acquaintance. She revised her assessment of him, upward and without difficulty. He scratched Anker's jaw once, murmured something too low for her to hear, and walked away without speaking to her further. She watched him go. He did not look back. She stood in the stall for a moment, let out the breath she had been holding, went back to raking. That evening, she wrote nothing in the small notebook she kept sewn into the lining of her coat. She had learned not to record anything that could identify her if the coat were found and searched. But she composed the entry in her mind, as she had begun to do on the more demanding days, in the private ledger behind her eyes. "He sees things," she wrote, "not in a way that announces itself, in a way that waits. Be careful." The ring on its cord felt heavy against her breastbone in the dark of the sleeping room. She pressed her fingertips to it through the fabric and felt the raised crest of the seal, cool, certain, unchanged. Her father's signet ring. The only thing she had taken from Fairfax House the night she left, that no one would know to look for because no one had known it existed except him and her. She put it out of her mind. She had work to do in the morning. She saw the handkerchief on a Tuesday in October when the cold had arrived in earnest, and the horses were restless with the smell of it on the air. The Duke had established a habit, or perhaps he had always had one, and she was only now positioned to observe it, of riding out before the rest of the household was fully awake, and returning at precisely the hour when the stable yard was at its most occupied. She had spent 3 weeks mapping the rhythms of this place. Who came when? Who watched from where? Who pretended not to watch but made a study of it regardless? She had become, over 3 years of necessity, expert at reading the social topography of a room from the corner of her eye. She was there when he returned, as she usually was, positioned near the far gate with Bristol's lead in her hands. Bristol was a bay stallion, with a coat like polished mahogany, and the emotional vocabulary of someone who had never quite recovered from a bad experience she had no way of knowing about. She and Bristol had reached an understanding in the 2nd week, a quiet one, built on consistency and the willingness to stand still and wait, that she thought of, privately, as one of the more functional relationships currently available to her. The Duke dismounted, handed the reins to Hartley, turned to say something, and in the turning, a cough, short, single, controlled in a way that spoke of long practice, the kind of cough a person suppresses rather than releases, contained by discipline rather than its own brevity. Then the handkerchief, white linen, drawn from his breast pocket with practiced speed and pressed briefly against his mouth. The motion lasted less than 3 seconds. He folded it away before she could see whether there was anything on it. She looked back at Bristol immediately. She ran her palm along the stallion's neck in the steady, firm stroke the horse had learned to expect from her, and she did not allow herself to stare. But the image was fixed. She had grown up reading her mother's medical texts. Her mother had been, in her private hours, an extraordinarily well-read woman, a gentlewoman physician in everything except the name the profession would not permit her to hold, a collector of medical volumes she kept beneath the floorboards of her dressing room, because her husband had found the habit improper and her daughter had found it indispensable. Lavinia Fairfax had learned to read Latin before she could manage a household. She had read treatises on the lung and the liver and the slow catastrophes that could unfold inside a body that showed every sign of being intact. A cough like that meant something specific, controlled, recurrent. The handkerchief retrieved too fast. She oiled tack that afternoon in the long, methodical silence she had perfected, her hands working the leather without need of her conscious attention, and she thought about what she had seen. A dry cough, suppressed. The east wing of the hall with its curtains drawn even on clear days. The subtle set of Crispin Devereux's jaw when he moved between rooms, a faint compression that might have been a decision, or might have been pain, or might have been both. She was a stable hand. The Duke's health was not her concern. His east wing was not her concern. His private habits and the stories they told were not her concern. Her concern was to remain here long enough for Greystone's men to stop searching for her in Surrey and begin looking somewhere else, and then to disappear again efficiently, leaving nothing that would make this place remember her. She folded the bridle she had finished, hung it on its hook, pressed her thumb against her father's ring through the fabric of her shirt, and felt the raised falcon of the crest press back. She thought about a man with storm-blue eyes and a handkerchief folded too quickly. She could not, to her own considerable irritation, stop thinking about it. She had not planned to go into the East Wing. It was not her work, it was not her purpose. It was emphatically not compatible with her carefully maintained project of invisibility. She had gone looking for a bucket, a specific one with a broken handle that Hartley swore had been left somewhere near the back passage, and that she had been tasked with retrieving before the afternoon was out. The passage had led her further than intended, through a door she had expected to be locked, which was not, and into the East Wing's ground floor corridor, where the smell immediately changed. She stopped inside the threshold. Lavender and beeswax, the universal vocabulary of a well-kept house, but beneath them, something else. Paper, dry and sweet in the way that large quantities of stored documents produced, and lamp oil, the residue of something recently burned. Somebody worked here regularly. She had walked into someone's active space. She should have turned back. The intelligent choice, the safe choice, was to step out, reclose the door behind her, and forget the passage entirely. She had made many intelligent choices in the past 3 years. She had survived by making them. She walked forward. 3 doors. The first was locked. Her hand found the latch and it held firm, so she moved on without pausing. The second opened onto a small room containing nothing but a rack of rolled maps and a plain table with a single chair, the kind of room that existed to hold things until someone had an opinion about them. The third room was where he worked. She knew it before she was fully through the door. The desk faced the window at an angle that would catch maximum morning light, a scholar's arrangement, not a gentleman's. Papers in ordered stacks, a glass inkwell with the stopper removed, and the pen resting across the lip still damp. A single oil lamp unlit at this hour. Books along one wall with their spines facing out and their titles legible. Not decorative volumes, but working ones. Reference texts, bound correspondence, a gazetteer of the southern counties. And on the desk, among the papers, a name in large block letters at the top of an open document. Fairfax. She crossed the threshold before she had decided to. The name had pulled her forward, with the sudden force of something she had not expected and was not prepared for. She stopped at the desk's edge, her hands clasped tight behind her back, and read what she could see without touching anything. Fairfax at the top, then in smaller hand beneath it, the matter of Sir Rowland Fairfax, deceased baronet of the county of... And then the rest was covered by another document laid half across it, and she would not move them, would not leave any trace of herself in this room. She would not shift a page or brush a surface, or leave behind anything that would tell the room she had been there. She stood very still. Her father's name, her father who had been dead 4 years, whose name she had spent the last 2 trying not to speak aloud, whose name should not by any ordinary arrangement of the universe be written on a desk in the private study of the Duke of Harwick. She heard a footstep in the corridor. She moved. Not running. Running was evidence. Running was a person who had been somewhere they should not. She walked to the door, through it, drew it almost closed behind her with the care of someone leaving a room they had passed without interest, and reached the far end of the corridor before the next footstep fell. The footstep paused outside the 3rd door. She kept walking. She found the bucket with the broken handle in a cupboard near the scullery entrance, exactly where it had been all along. She carried it back to the stable yard with both hands, and she spent the rest of the afternoon informing herself firmly and repeatedly that there was a reasonable explanation. By nightfall, she had not thought of one. He sent for her on a Thursday through a footman, which was unusual enough to stop everything in the stable yard for approximately 5 seconds. The footman arrived with the expression of a man who found the errand beneath his dignity and the smell of the stable yard beneath his tolerances, and delivered his message with the compressed emphasis of someone who had been assigned this task specifically to test his character. The Duke wished to see the new stable hand. The quiet one. Pip, beside her, made a face that communicated genuine human sympathy. She handed him the brush she had been using on Bristol and followed the footman without visible reaction. The route through the servants' entrance and along the back passage took her past 2 doorways she had not passed before, both of them closed. She catalogued them. She always catalogued them. She had lived for 3 years in the permanent state of a person who needed to know all available exits before they needed to use one. The room she was shown into was not the East Wing study. She noticed this immediately, with the precision of a person taking a careful breath. It was something closer to the central house, a small receiving room, low-ceilinged, with bookshelves on 2 walls, and an unlit fireplace and a window that looked onto the kitchen garden. A room for conversations that needed privacy, but not formality. She stood. She waited. He came in from a side door and closed it behind him. A coat of dark blue today, well cut, with brass buttons she noticed because everything in her was already measuring. He did not sit. He stood on the opposite side of a small oak table and looked at her. "I am not going to dismiss you," he said. "I want to be clear about that before I say anything further, because the people who work here have a tendency to assume the worst when they are called in." She inclined her head. He reached across the table and took her left hand. Not asked, simply reached and turned her hand over, palm up, his fingers warm around her wrist. The directness of it was so unexpected that she did not pull away. He studied her palm, the lines of it, then turned her hand to look at the back, and then he set it down with the care one might use returning something borrowed. "Ink," he said, "here at the base of the index finger, and here where it has marked the webbing." He clasped his own hands behind his back. "A stable hand who writes, frequently, I would judge, and not so very long ago that it has entirely faded." She kept her face still. She looked at the marks on her hand as though seeing them for the first time, which was a performance she was aware did not quite land. He was watching her. She raised her eyes to his and said nothing. She was Lev, who did not speak. She kept the silence exactly as long as it needed to be kept. "I am not asking you to explain yourself," he said. "I am telling you what I observed. You may respond however seems right to you." She opened her hands and spread them, a gesture that said, "Here I am, do with that what you will." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite softness, a recalibration of some kind, the way a calculation changes when a variable turns out to be different than assumed. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, she heard the house around them, a door somewhere, distant footsteps on stone, the ordinary weight of a large building going about its day. "My late mother was a scholar," he said in a tone that was not quite making conversation. "She had ink stains she was never quite able to remove from her hands. She used to say they were the marks of a well-used mind." He paused, just slightly. She was right. He looked at her for another moment. She could not read what he was deciding. Then, "You may go." She went. Pip asked in the stable yard what the Duke had wanted. She mimed writing with her finger against her palm and shrugged, a gesture that said odd but harmless, and Pip seemed satisfied with the explanation, or else simply not interested enough to press it. She was not satisfied at all. She was, in fact, less settled than she had been when she walked in, which she had not thought possible. He had observed her hands, told her what he saw, told her a story about his mother, and then dismissed her without asking anything. That was not a man who was satisfied. That was a man who had filed something away. The cord broke on a morning in early November, when the cold had finally reached the marrow of the stone walls, and the horses were fractious with the change in the air. She was carrying water to the far stall, 2 heavy buckets, one in each hand. The measured rhythm she had learned distributed the weight across both shoulders without favoring either. And the knot she had tied and retied a dozen times over the past months finally gave up the arrangement. She felt the tension release. She felt the weight leave her chest. She heard the ring strike the cobblestones. A small sound, a single soft metallic note, startlingly clear against the stone, and she set the buckets down and turned, and it was not where she expected it to be. It had rolled. 3-4 feet to the right, with the swift efficiency of a small round object on a cold flat surface, and it had come to rest against the base of the stall directly opposite, where the Duke of Harwick was standing. He looked down. The ring lay at the toe of his boot, and he looked at it. Then he crouched, a fluid, unhurried movement that gave her no time to step forward and intervene, and picked it up between 2 fingers with the careful precision of someone handling something small and potentially significant. She walked to him. She held out her hand, flat-palmed. She kept her expression carefully, absolutely still. He did not place the ring in her palm. He turned it between his fingers. He was looking at the seal face, the crest pressed into the dull gold of the signet, the bird with its wings opened and its body rising. She watched his face, watched what the crest did to his expression as he read it, as he read the motto in its small engraved letters beneath. Veritas et honor, truth and honor, the Fairfax motto, on the Fairfax ring. He was not surprised. That was what she would remember of this moment, long after everything else had shifted, that he was not surprised. His face changed, yes, but not into surprise, into the still careful expression of a man confirming what he already held to be true, a calculation completed, a missing piece identified and placed. He set the ring in her outstretched palm. Their fingers did not touch. He withdrew his hand unhurried and stood. He was a head taller than her in her borrowed boots and her carefully constructed disguise, and she was acutely aware for the first time in weeks that she was much smaller than she usually felt. "The cord wants replacing," he said. His tone was even. "Use something stouter. This kind of thing tends to happen at inconvenient times." Then he walked away. She heard his footsteps cross the stable yard and recede, and she stood quite still until they were gone. Then she went to the tack room, found a length of leather cord among the bridal repair materials, and threaded the ring herself with hands that she would not allow to shake, with the slow deliberateness of someone performing a task that is not really about the task. He knew. She was almost entirely certain now that he knew, had known perhaps for some time, and she could not, for all her considerable capacity for analysis, understand why he had said nothing. He came to the stable yard that evening after the rest of the grooms had gone to supper. She had stayed behind. She often did in the hour between work and food, because solitude had become the only real luxury available to her, and she had learned to take it wherever the day allowed. She was sitting on an overturned crate near Anchor's stall, doing nothing in particular with the intense focus of a person whose mind was very busy when she heard the stable door. She knew it was him before she turned, the weight of the step by now as familiar as her own. He stood in the entrance. The last of the November daylight was behind him, orange and fading at the edges, and for a moment he was only a silhouette in the doorway, broad-shouldered, still, watching. The horses moved in their stalls. Anchor, predictably, did not. "I am going to ask you to stop pretending," he said. She looked at him. "Not the muteness," he added, with the precision of someone who had thought about how this conversation would begin. "That you may keep if you feel you need it. I mean the rest of it. The performance of having nothing to hide." She stood from the crate, slowly and deliberately in the way she did everything when she needed time to think. He moved further into the stable, away from the open door, giving the conversation a wall on one side, privacy on the other. She noted the instinct. He thought about these things. She added it to everything else she had been accumulating about him, without intending to. "I have known since the second week," he said. "The ring I verified. But before that, the ink, the way you hold a pitchfork, which is the way someone holds a pitchfork when they have been taught to hold it correctly, and not the way someone holds one who has been doing it since childhood. The way your eyes move when you enter a new space." He paused. "You read every room you walk into. You count the exits." She said, "Yes." The word came out smaller than she had expected. She had not used her own voice, her actual voice without restriction or performance, in more than 2 years. It sounded faintly foreign to her, like a language she had learned young and then left alone in a drawer. "Yes," she said again, more steadily. "I am Lavinia Fairfax, Sir Rowland's daughter." Something in him settled, hearing this. Not relief, exactly. More like the closing of an open question. "You should have told me when you knew," she said. "The moment you recognized me, you should have..." "Done what?" His tone was direct, not unkind. "Confronted you. A young woman traveling under a false identity for reasons you had not yet chosen to explain, in the middle of a working stable yard within earshot of 4 other employees." A pause measured. "I chose to wait. You chose to observe me. I chose to keep you safe," he said. And something in the way he said it made the words land differently than she had prepared herself for. Not authority. Not the condescension of a man explaining his reasoning to someone who had not asked. Something that carried the texture of truth, plain and without embellishment. She held his gaze. The horses were quiet around them. Outside, the light had finished fading. "Why would you keep me safe?" she said. "You do not know me." "No," he said, "but I knew your father." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that opens to make room for things that are too large for words to handle all at once. He let it stand for a moment. Then, "I am going to explain what is in the East Wing study. Not tonight, sir. There is too much to say, and the timing of your absence from supper will be noticed soon. But I need you to hold on a little longer, Lev." The name, her false name in his mouth, had a distinct quality, careful and slightly ironic. "Before I can explain everything." "I am not," she said with precision, "very good at trust." "No," he agreed without defensiveness. "I would imagine you are not, given your circumstances. I am asking for a few days. Friday." She looked at him. She ran the calculation she was always running. Options, risks, what she had, and what she stood to lose. What she had here was relative safety and a name she had not had to use. What she stood to lose was a great deal more uncertain. "Until Friday," she said. He nodded once. He left without ceremony, without softness, without anything that could precisely be called warmth except for the single fact that he had thought before speaking, that he had come here in the evening privately and offered her a few more days before requiring her to trust him. She sat back down on the crate. Anchor hung his grey head over the stall door and regarded her with the benign, mild interest he reserved for things he had decided were not threats. "Don't look at me like that," she said. Anchor blinked. They came on a Wednesday, 11 days after he had first spoken to her as herself. 2 men on horseback, arriving at the main gate just past noon, with the distinct bearing of men who had been hired to find something and had run the trail to its current end, and were not accustomed to being told they were wrong. She saw them from the hayloft. She had been up there for a different reason entirely, a loose board in the floor that needed addressing before one of the horses found it. And she had heard the hoofbeats before she saw the horses, and some instinct older than thought had pressed her flat into the hay before her mind had fully named what she was afraid of. She lay still and looked through the gap between the boards at the stable yard below. Hartley went to the gate. The exchange was brief. She could not hear the individual words at this distance, only the shape of them, Hartley's careful, deliberate syllables, and the stranger's clipped, impatient ones. One of the men held a folded paper. She did not need to read it. She knew what it was. She had been expecting this for 2 years. She had simply hoped each time she moved somewhere new that the hope would prove itself true. She pressed her cheek against the hay. The smell of it, dry, warm, dust and summer stored against the cold, was the same in every stable she had ever hidden in. She counted her own heartbeats instead of time, which she had learned was more reliable under these circumstances. Then a different voice, closer. She raised her head. The Duke stood at the entrance to the stable yard. She had not heard him come. He was simply present. In the plain dark coat she associated with him now with something she refused to call comfort, standing at the center of the yard with the full authority of his title visible in the way he held himself. Not a performance, just certainty, the absolute assurance of a man who owned this ground and was not in any difficulty about it. He spoke to the men at the gate. She heard fragments. "My household, not aware of any such. You are, of course, welcome to contact my solicitor, whose name is—" The calm, deliberate cadence of a man who had faced hostile questions before and understood that the weapon of choice in these encounters was patience. One of the men pushed the gate open and walked into the yard. She pressed herself flatter. "You are welcome," the Duke said, perfectly even, "to look wherever you choose. I will, of course, have my man make a full record of your visit for presentation to the local magistrate, whom I know tolerably well." A pause. 2 beats, measured and unhurried. "Unless you have a warrant, in which case this is all considerably simpler." A longer silence. She could not see the man's face. She watched the Duke's. "We were mistaken," the first man said finally. "Your Grace, good day." She heard the gate close. She heard the horses on the gravel retreating down the drive, growing faint and then absent. She did not move for several minutes after the sound was entirely gone. The hay settled around her with each careful breath. Below, she heard the Duke say something to Hartley, a single sentence too low to carry, and then footsteps approaching the foot of the ladder. He did not climb it. "You can come down when you are ready," he said to the boards above him. "Take whatever time you need." She lay still for one more moment. She pressed the heel of her hand against her closed eyes. Then she descended the ladder, stepping down into the dim of the stable, with the steady care of a person controlling their own speed, and stood at the foot of it in the cold, hay-smelling air. He was 3 feet away. In the thin November light she could see, clearly for the first time, the lines of fatigue around his mouth. Not the short-term kind, not the fatigue of a difficult week, the structural kind, the kind that settles into the architecture of a face over a long period and becomes part of the features. She had not let herself look at him this directly before now. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he confirmed. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, as though she was something worth looking at carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. He did not say he was glad to hear it, which she appreciated. He simply nodded once and left her to her own management, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. He showed her on Friday morning in the East Wing study, with the curtains opened for the first time she had seen, and the thin winter sunlight doing what it could across the desk and the stacks of paper on it. She sat across from him in a chair he had placed there, not behind the desk but to the side of it, parallel, so they were both facing the light. She had dressed that morning in the plainest thing she had been able to assemble, a grey wool dress she had borrowed from the housekeeper's mending basket, explaining by gesture that she needed something for a specific task. The housekeeper, a woman of practical sympathies and apparently few questions, had provided it without comment. It felt strange, the absence of the cap, the absence of the extra cloth at the shoulders, the quiet strangeness of sitting in a chair the way she used to sit in a chair, upright and present, without having to manage the posture of someone else. He placed the Fairfax document in the center of the desk, where she could read it fully. He began at the beginning. Her father, Sir Rowland Fairfax, Baronet, linguist, privately modest and publicly unremarkable, had been engaged since approximately 1807 in a quiet arrangement with an intelligence office of the Crown. Not a dangerous one, in the conventional sense. A scholarly one. Sir Rowland had been a linguist of genuine precision, fluent in French, German, Italian, and enough Russian to be useful, and he had been called upon periodically to verify the authenticity of foreign documents, to confirm provenance, to identify forgeries, to provide the kind of expert attestation that could not easily be publicly attributed. He had done this without fanfare, without title, without the acknowledgement that would have made the work visible. When Sir Rowland died, suddenly of the heart in the winter of 1822, the documents in his possession had been seized by his creditors before any family member could catalogue them or request their return. Several of those documents had made their way, through a series of transactions she could follow on the pages before her, to the hands of Viscount Greystone, who had held the Fairfax debts, who had understood, with the quick intelligence of a man who built power on information, exactly what he was holding. Greystone had not used the documents as leverage. He had used their absence. He had implied to the right people that Sir Rowland's private work had been less than sanctioned, had suggested in the discreet way that certain men suggest things they cannot prove, that the Crown arrangement had not been official, that Sir Rowland had been conducting independent communications with foreign parties. The implications were enough, in an atmosphere of suspicion, to do considerable damage without a single direct accusation. The result had been the ruin of the Fairfax name by association, moving too slowly to be traced to a single cause. The estate, technically still in existence, but its finances controlled. Her guardianship assigned to Greystone himself, because no one with better claim could be found who was willing to take the trouble. "I was sent," Crispin said, "to recover what could be recovered. The documents on this desk are the originals your father worked with at the time of his death, plus the signed correspondence confirming that the arrangement was fully sanctioned at the highest level of the office." He paused. "I found them in Greystone's country house 4 months ago, through means I will not detail, because the detail is not relevant to you." She looked at the pages. She reached out and touched the top corner of the Fairfax document, the one she had seen partially, standing in this room without permission, weeks ago. The paper was smooth and cold under her fingertip. "This clears him," she said, "entirely. Why haven't you submitted it already? The officer authorized to receive this kind of submission retired in August," he said. "His successor takes office in January. I am waiting for a formal handoff, one that cannot be procedurally challenged, because Greystone has sufficient influence to argue against an informal submission, and I will not give him that opening." He looked at her steadily. "If the submission is made correctly, it cannot be undone. I intend it to be made correctly." She looked at him across her father's name. She looked at the lines of fatigue around his mouth, which she had been thinking about since she saw them clearly in the stable yard. "How long have you been ill?" she asked. A pause. "Long enough," he said, "to understand the importance of finishing what I started before I am in a diminished position to advocate for it." "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it is not." She thought of the handkerchief, the cough, the curtains drawn against the light. She thought of her mother's medical texts, of the specific chapter she had read and reread as a girl because it had frightened her, and she had learned that what frightened her was best understood rather than avoided. "What is wrong with your lungs?" she said. He told her. It was a longer explanation than she had expected, and more precise, and she sat with it for a moment after he finished. "There is a treatment," she said. "Not a cure, but a treatment that slows progression. A physician in Edinburgh has been writing about it in correspondence that was read into the medical record last year. My mother would have known about it." She paused. "I know about it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are suggesting you would help me." "I am telling you there is a treatment," she said. "What you do with that information is your own business." Something in his expression did what it always did when she surprised him. That small recalibration, the variable adjusted. She was beginning to find it, against all her intentions, not unpleasant to observe. Greystone arrived on a Saturday, not with hired men this time, in person. His own carriage, his own crest on the door in the early afternoon when the light was flat and grey and the cold had the quality of a decision rather than a passing condition. She heard the carriage on the drive, and she was in the East Wing study before she had consciously decided to go there, moving on instinct, on the sharp urgency of a body that had been anticipating this moment for longer than her mind had been willing to acknowledge. Crispin was already at the desk. He looked up when she came in. "Stay here," he said. "I will not," she said. A silence of roughly 3 seconds. He looked at her, and she looked back, and whatever he found in her expression made him decide not to pursue the argument. To the left of the door, he said, behind me and out of the direct line of sight from the entrance. She stood to his left. She did not argue about the positioning. He met Greystone in the main salon. She took her place in the adjoining room, far enough back to be invisible from the salon's entrance, close enough to hear everything clearly. She had done this before, in other houses, in other difficult moments, positioned herself at the edge of a room and listened to conversations about her own fate. She had become good at it. What followed was the kind of conversation that maintained a surface of civility while being entirely otherwise. She knew Greystone's voice. She had heard it at dinner tables. She had not been permitted to leave. In carriages, she had not been able to exit across the narrow width of a guardian's study that had felt on several occasions like a space specifically designed to remind her of her own smallness. He said he was there out of concern for his ward. He said he had received certain intelligence, the word chosen deliberately, she was certain of it, suggesting Lady Lavinia Fairfax might have been seen in the vicinity. He said he would be remiss in his duty if he did not pursue it. Crispin said he was not aware of any young woman of that description in the surrounding area. He said it without inflection, without the fractional pause that indicates something withheld. She had come to understand over these weeks that his evenness was not the absence of feeling. It was the discipline of it, something kept in its place by long practice, like water held behind a well-built wall. Greystone asked if he might speak with the household staff. Crispin said, "My solicitor's name, should you find yourself requiring it, is Pemberton. Correspondence may be addressed to him at his Lincoln's Inn chambers. I believe I have answered your question." A pause. She heard Greystone shift his weight. "Harwick," Greystone said, and the civility had gone out of the voice entirely. "You know what I hold on the Fairfax estate. You know that whatever story someone might try to construct in defense of that family, I have the means to make it very difficult. Very difficult indeed." A silence. "I know," Crispin said, "that you believe that." His voice was entirely steady, and in the steadiness she heard something that was not quite anger, something colder and more purposeful than anger. "Good day, Greystone." She heard the front door close, the crunch of gravel, the carriage retreating down the drive. She came into the corridor. Crispin was standing at the hall table with one hand braced against the wall, not the natural stance of a man who had just successfully concluded a difficult conversation. She looked at his face. The pallor was visible even in the dim light of the corridor. The cough, she thought, the sustained effort of that kind of conversation on lungs that were not working as they once had. "Sit down," she said. He turned to look at her. "Hello," she said in the same tone she used when a horse needed to understand that the instruction was not a suggestion. He sat in the chair at the hall table, and she went to her knees beside it and found his wrist with her fingers, pressing into the pulse point the way her mother had shown her, faster than it should be. The strain of the past half hour was in his blood, visible and countable. She looked up. He looked down. The position was, she was distantly aware, extremely strange. Him seated, her kneeling, her hand at his wrist, the house quiet around them after the departure of the worst thing she had been afraid of. She held on to the strangeness for a moment, and then let it go because there was no practical use in it. "Breathe with me," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. Then, without argument, he did. She counted. 4 beats in, hold, 4 beats out. And he followed, and she felt the pulse under her fingers begin gradually to slow. "The documents," he said when the pulse had come down to something closer to acceptable, "will be submitted in January," she said, "as we planned. Greystone threatening you about it tells me he knows he cannot stop a formal submission by legal means. He can make noise. He cannot overturn a correctly filed Crown document, and he knows it." A pause. "You have been thinking through the legal specifics," he said. "I have been thinking of little else for approximately 3 weeks," she said. "The law around Crown intelligence attestations is not widely understood, but my father's arrangement created a paper trail that Greystone cannot erase because he does not know it exists." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned his wrist, not pulling away from her hand but turning it, until his fingers found hers and held them. Not a formal gesture, not anything she had a name for yet, something that was the shape of all the words neither of them was ready to say. "Lavinia," he said, the first time he had used her name directly. "Crispin," she said. She used his in return, with the same deliberateness. She felt him exhale. A real breath, not the controlled ones of the past minutes, something releasing. "I did not intend for you to be here for this," he said, "for any of it." "I know," she said. Nevertheless. The hallway was quiet around them. Outside, through the narrow window at the corridor's end, the November afternoon was nearly finished. She did not move her hand from his wrist. His pulse was steady now. She thought about a letter she needed to write to the physician in Edinburgh. She thought, enough. Enough hiding. Enough waiting. She thought, whatever comes in January, I will be here for it. Epilogue, 6 months later. Harwick Hall and the walled garden in full spring. The documents had been submitted in January as planned. The process had taken 2 additional months and a visit to London in February that Lavinia had argued herself into accompanying on the grounds that the matter concerned her father and that she had been making her own arguments since she was 12 years old, and that Crispin, to his lasting credit, had not tried to tell her this was untrue. The submission had been received. Greystone's counter-arguments had failed, not dramatically, not in a scene of public exposure, but in the quiet, administrative way that certain kinds of wrongdoing are ultimately undone. A document filed, a determination made, a name formally cleared in a record that would outlast everyone in the room. By March, Viscount Greystone was engaged in his own rather serious conversations with the Crown regarding the acquisition and use of estate papers that had not been his to acquire. By April, the guardianship of Lady Lavinia Fairfax was formally dissolved as unnecessary. She was standing in the walled garden on a warm afternoon in May, reading a letter from her solicitor about the current state of the Fairfax estate. Poor, but not beyond recovery, which she was beginning to consider the family motto, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. Crispin came to stand beside her. He was not coughing today. The treatment she had researched from her mother's texts and confirmed through a correspondence with the Edinburgh physician that had taken 4 months and considerable persistence on her part had not cured him. She was a pragmatist and would not pretend otherwise. But it had slowed what it could slow, and the winter had passed better than the one before it. She intended the next one to be better still. He read the solicitor's letter over her shoulder. "Poor but not beyond recovery," he said. "Like most things," she said. He took the letter from her hand without ceremony, set it on the garden bench, and replaced it with his own hand. Palm against hers, fingers settling into the familiar arrangement they had arrived at over the past months, without either of them commenting on it directly. The natural way of 2 people who had stopped pretending to require distance from each other. The Fairfax ring was still on its cord at her neck. There had been in February a conversation about that. Then a longer conversation. Then a quiet evening in the East Wing study, in which a great deal had been said that neither of them had been especially graceful about saying, which she thought made it more honest rather than less. "You are staying," he said. Not quite a question. "I am staying," she said, "though I want it noted that I intend to have full access to the East Wing study." "You have always had access to the East Wing study." "I know," she said. "I simply want it to be explicit." He turned to look at her, the same deliberate attention that had unnerved her in the stable yard on that grey October morning, the look she had spent weeks trying to deflect, and had eventually stopped trying to deflect because it had turned out to be less threatening and more honest than she had been prepared to accommodate. The look of a man who considers things worth looking at carefully to be worth looking at carefully. "Explicit is good," he said. She turned her face toward the paddock beyond the garden wall. Anchor was visible in the afternoon light, head up and self-satisfied, standing at the gate with the authority of an animal who has decided he deserves to be noticed. Pip, now a junior groom and growing into his position with the enthusiasm of someone who has found his natural occupation, was attempting to explain something to the horse that the horse was choosing to ignore. She felt Crispin's thumb trace once across the back of her hand. A small motion. precise and deliberate, the way he did everything that mattered to him. She pressed her fingers into his and held on. The afternoon light fell clean and unhurried across the stones of Harwick Hall, warm in the distinct way of things that had been worked for. She stood in it. She let herself stand in it. She had been invisible for 3 years. She had been a name erased, and a face hidden, and a voice she had not used. She was here now, present, known. She had counted so many exits. It was, she thought, more interesting to count the things worth staying for, stories told with quiet love.